Tonight, a new perspective on circumcision, a practice cloaked for centuries in social, religious, and medical significance. Some are now describing it as mutilation, others as illegal.
I have to make it so he doesn't move.
It happens every minute of every day. Newborn baby boys like little Michael are circumcised.
When you're born in this world, your body is your birthright.
I get letters constantly. I get phone calls constantly.
Jim Bigelow is a psychologist and former minister who's written a book questioning circumcision. A practice, Bigelow says, that, like this old phonograph recording, should be relegated to history.
The male foreskin is the only human organ that any medical profession allows a surgeon to remove when it is perfectly healthy, when it is perfectly normal, and when it is functioning perfectly.
So I think the anger stems from the idiocy of the whole thing. Why do it? There is no good reason to do it.
And that's what these men are asking.
And a lot of men are feeling mutilated. More and more men are feeling mutilated.
This group meets each month in Montreal.
When I was a baby and I'm not able to decide, I think it takes a part of me without my authorization.
The main consideration for me is that I've been deprived of this sensitivity throughout the whole of my life. What for?
In fact, historically, the foreskin was removed to desensitize the head of the penis and reduce sexual pleasure. That's why it was done to the slaves in Roman times. And that's why it enjoyed a resurgence in the 1800s, promoted across North America as a treatment for insanity, epilepsy, and to control masturbation. A key proponent was John Harvey Kellogg of Cornflakes fame. He wrote that circumcision, particularly when done without anesthetic, has a healthy effect on the mind, especially if it's connected with the idea of punishment. The practice continues today, according to Jim Bigelow, largely because circumcised men simply want their sons to look like them.
When I wrote a part of my book where I had to deal with the statistics of what we're doing today, every day in the hospitals, I can remember weeping. I think, oh my God, what have we done? And what are we continuing to do?
Over the last 2 years, several medical associations, including the Canadian Pediatric Society, have issued statements discouraging the use of routine infant circumcision. The reason why? There has been mounting scientific evidence suggesting there are few, if any, health benefits to the child.
Yes, I think it's time that we stop this procedure.
David Olwyn is a Montreal area physician and a member of Doctors Opposing Circumcision. He's reviewed the latest scientific research and has found considerable evidence against circumcision.
As physicians, we really don't have good reason to continue this practice.
Studies that show circumcising without anesthetic, a still common practice, makes babies more sensitive to pain later in life. Studies that show the procedure does not prevent hospitalizations due to severe urinary tract infections. And studies that show circumcision offers minimal protection against cancer of the penis later in adulthood. And then a little-known but important Canadian study by Dr. John Taylor in Winnipeg, who looked at the foreskin under the microscope. He found highly sensitive cells, cells like those in our fingertips and lips, vital erogenous tissue that's being cut and thrown away. With so much contrary evidence, David Olwyn says doctors who continue performing circumcisions are violating a professional code which prohibits unnecessary medical procedures. So all these doctors who are doing circumcisions,
they're doing so unethically.
Are you saying that doctors who perform circumcisions are unethical?
Yes.
Dr. Neil Pollack performs about 1,000 circumcisions each year. Dr. Pollack says he believes circumcision still offers several benefits. He'll argue that it can reduce the number of urinary tract infections, decrease the incidence of penile cancer, and reduce the risk of AIDS. It's all, he says, in how you interpret the scientific data.
I'm angry at the fact that people are willing to do something so drastic with so little information.
But what's more, circumcision may in fact already be illegal under the Canadian Criminal Code.
What you've got is an intervention on a child without the child's consent for a non-therapeutic purpose.
Margaret Somerville is a lawyer who studies medical ethics at McGill University in Montreal. She says that if there are no clear benefits to circumcision, no one, not even parents, can consent to a non-therapeutic procedure.
And I think most of them would be shocked to think that they were contravening the criminal code. But I believe that in fact they are. So it's a question of whether we would want to activate that law and actually apply it rather than just having it there on the books.
In fact, she was drawn into the debate because of an uncomfortable parallel with female circumcision, where parts of a girl's genitals are cut off. That's prohibited in Canada. Should the same apply to boys?
Maybe something we've been doing isn't ethical. We should step back and rethink it.
The growing evidence against infant circumcision is in fact challenging its religious practice, a practice rooted in centuries of tradition among Muslims and among those of the Jewish faith.
What's wrong with it is we didn't realize what we were doing for all these thousands of years, and that's what's changing now is we're learning new information, we're discovering that this is harmful.
Ronald Goldman is a psychologist and author of a newly published book, Questioning Circumcision, a Jewish Perspective.
There's a growing recognition of respecting what the child would want. Circumcision is not something in the Jewish community that we volunteer for to do on ourselves. This is something that is forced on a baby.
In Wayne Hampton's opinion, there is no justification, religious or otherwise, for circumcision. And what's more, Wayne can now say that he knows the difference. He's one of a small but growing number of men who have restored their foreskins, a process based on a book called The Joy of Uncircumcising, written by psychologist Jim Bigelow.
More and more as men learn that they really do have an option, that something can be done, then we expect to hear from thousands and thousands of more of men who never thought it would do any good to complain.
Get enough foam to make a set in several sizes.
It's non-surgical and involves stretching the skin over the head of the penis using tapes and elastics.
Slow process, I can tell you that.
And at the men's support group in Montreal, they discuss not only the effects of circumcision, but the technical points and the benefits of foreskin restoration.
There's been a marked increase in sensitivity, very, very marked.
It's for the sensitivity too.
I couldn't begin to tell you the number of men who write to say, for the first time in my life I stand in front of a mirror, or I go to the Y or to the gym, and I feel normal. I feel whole.
There are switches here.
It took Wayne Hampton over 3 years to restore his foreskin. He and his wife Catherine say it's made a big difference to his self-esteem and to their love life. Not surprisingly, Wayne and Catherine chose not to circumcise their son and are urging other parents to do the same, to allow the next generation of boys the right to make this important decision on their own.
Hello again, and welcome to the Valkyrie Underground. Thank you so much for joining me, your host, Urban Jungle Girl, on the Might Is Right network at mightisright.net. Today is Wotan's Day, February the 3rd, 2016. The links for the pieces that I'm going to present tonight are posted on the TalkShoe page for my shows, and they are at show number 136692. And if you wish to talk or chat during the show, please do so using the chat room at mightisright.net. So, what I'm going to be presenting tonight is a history of circumcision in the United States. It's titled A Short History, but it was actually quite long, so I have edited that a bit, so you can read that whole thing from the links on the show page. So let me begin. Now, before I begin, I want to say this, that circumcision is a crime against all of our people, and it's not addressed on the level that it needs to be. There have been some good shows in the past few years, but not enough, not often enough, and people really don't hear this information. I have personally not been successful in stopping anyone from having this done to their newborn sons. That makes me very sad. That's why this is so very important. And I also want to say that don't fail to understand that although the history that I'm going to present, although it doesn't speak so much about the religious aspect of this, it's certainly apparent that Judeo-Christianity rests at the very heart of this butchery in the United States. And while this is a procedure that has been stopped in almost all of the European countries and in Canada and just about everywhere else, only the United States is on par with the Arabs, the Muslims, and some African countries. It's incredible, really. Spread this information. Take the show, send it to people, and perhaps we can affect some change. Keep in mind, as I'm reading this material, that the AMA was formed in 1847 and that the Schofield Reference Bible was introduced in 1908. Also big factors in all of this. So, let me begin. For the past 300 years, the American medical industry has been involved in the business of removing part or all of the external sexual organs of male and female children. While the origins of sexual mutilations among prehistoric and primitive peoples is a matter for theory and speculation, the origin and spread of sexual mutilation in America medical practice can be precisely documented. Seen in the proper context of the entire scope of Western history, the modern American enigma of institutionalized sexual mutilation is an historic aberration of profound significance and degree, one that could never have been predicted, or could it? The introduction and spread of institutionalized secular sexual mutilation was a response to the tremendous social and cultural anxieties engendered by the effects of the rapid modernization and industrialization of the early decades of the 19th century. As the traditional rural agrarian economy was transformed into an urbanized capitalist economy, parallel changes occurred in social structure, governmental and non-governmental institutions, demographics, and technology. One significant result of these changes was the ascendancy of the middle class. The medical establishment validated these social changes and offered treatment for the anxieties they inevitably produced, thereby laying the foundation of the modern therapeutic state, defined by Thomas Saz, S-Z-A-S-Z, Jew, in the political order in which social controls are legitimized by the ideology of health. For instance, the traditional agrarian society, adulthood was considered to begin at puberty. Industrialized middle-class society extended the boundaries of childhood by more than a decade so that middle-class males could receive the specialized professional and academic training required by a modern industrialized society. The formidable anxieties engendered by this transformation found expression in an intensified focus on childhood sexuality. In conformity with middle-class social mores, physicians theorized that childhood should be a period of complete asexuality, and consequently that children should be kept ignorant of sexual and reproductive information until their delayed marriage. The functional significance of this change was that young people who in previous generations had been expected to marry and commence sexual activity in early adolescence were now required to restrain themselves from sexual activity and remain continent until they were in their 20s. Young people who were unable to suppress their sexual drives were subjected not only to social censure, but to medical interventions as well. For reasons unrelated to the rise of the American middle class, two French physicians in the 1820s, Xavier Bichat, B-I-C-H-A-T, 1771 to 1802, and Francois Brousse, 1771 to 1838, developed a new model of disease, the theory degenerative disease. The model postulated that the human body was allotted a finite amount of vital energy, which could either be conserved through correct living or permanently lost through wrong living. Energy depletion led to degeneration, which in turn led to the production of disease. Middle-class American physicians readily adopted this theory, but they expanded it to imply that manifestations of sexuality necessarily represented life-threatening losses of vital energy. Non-productive use of the sexual organs, even within marriage, was viewed as dangerous. The result was the formulation of the reflex neurosis theory of disease, which postulated that the sexual organs and the erotic sensations they produced were the cause of all human disease. To validate this theory, American physicians redefined normal human sexual behavior, reproductive anatomy, and sexual function in terms of pathology. The pathologization of normal sexual behavior resulted in the masturbation hysteria. The term masturbation was frequently used in a generalized way to describe any sexual activity outside the context of heterosexual marital coitus for the purpose of procreation. But in practice, a diagnosis of masturbation generally followed the discovery of a child's either having sexually stimulated him or herself or having engaged in sexual activity with another person. Physicians relied on spurious logic to support the pathologization of sexual behavior. Clinical interviews with patients suffering from what would today be ascribed to the effects of malnutrition, overwork, venereal disease, bacterial or viral infections, mental disorders, and tobacco or alcohol poisoning invariably revealed a past history of masturbatory activity. On this basis, it was easy to conclude that masturbation had brought on these conditions. The inhabitants of the United States were at first reluctant to accept the theory that masturbation was harmful, and many resisted doctors' interference in the lives of their children. But the rising flood of articles in medical journals that allegedly proved the harm of masturbation gave physicians the power to overcome this resistance and enforce their own convictions. In order to validate the reflex neurosis theory of disease, physicians were compelled to pathologize the three distinguishing features of the normal juvenile foreskin, namely generous length, adherence to glands, and narrowness of the perputial orifice. Perputial. These perfectly natural qualities were demonized under the general diagnosis of phimosis. Physicians coined the term congenital phimosis to specify that the adhesion of the immature foreskin to the glands in infants was really a congenital birth defect. They adopted the term acquired phimosis to indicate a fictitious condition in which a previously detached foreskin became adherent as a result of masturbation. The term hypertrophic phimosis or redundancy indicated a type of phimosis whose sole symptom was a foreskin that doctors arbitrarily deemed to be, quote, too long. Since the foreskin is the most highly innervated part of the penis, and since masturbation among normal boys generally involves manually stimulating and manipulating the foreskin and sliding the mobile sheath of the penile skin up and over the shaft, masturbation was seen as a cause of reflex disease through the medium of the foreskin. In the absence of the germ theory of disease, American physicians who did not regard masturbation alone as the primary cause of disease attributed bacterial, viral, and fungal diseases, as well as the pathological symptoms of malnutrition, overwork, etc., to phimosis. Even in the absence of a diagnosis of phimosis, the foreskin itself was indicated as a cause of disease. Phimosis in females, defined as adherence of the clitoral prepuce to the clitoris, was viewed in much the same light. In accordance with the reflex theory of disease, erotic sensation was redefined as irritation. Orgasm was redefined as convulsion, and erection was redefined as priapism. Physicians argued that these manifestations of sexual function were both symptoms and cause of disease, and likewise that stimulation of the genitals could cause problems in distant parts of the body, such as the heart, brain, back, digestive organs, and eyes. The pathologization of normal male sexual function soon led to the invention of spermatoria. Physicians defined spermatoria, and that's spelled spermatorrhoea, as a serious venereal disease whose sole symptom was the ejaculation of sperm under any condition other than marital intercourse. The release of sperm in nocturnal emissions or masturbation was now classified as a venereal disease as dangerous as any other, if not more dangerous, because people suffered from it more often. Hundreds of case reports published in medical journals all over the Western world proved to the satisfaction of most physicians that spermatoria was a real and dangerous disease. French physicians such as Claude François Lallemande, 1790 to 1853, and Leopold Deslandes, 1797 to 1852, were the acknowledged world authorities in the treatment of spermatoria. Their preferred treatment was to insert long steel rods known as bougies, B-O-U-G-I-E-S, up the urethra and cauterize the passage, as well as the prostate and seminal vesicle, with silver nitrate. This was supposedly to slow the production and halt the loss of sperm. Lallemande also advised amputation of the foreskin in difficult cases of spermatoria and in order to stop masturbation among boys. Since surgical amputation of body parts in general was considered thoroughly modern and advanced, physicians experimented with specific amputations of the sexual organs to treat masturbation. In 1842, the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, now the New England Journal of Medicine, reported that Dr. Winslow Lewis of Boston had severed and tied the left spermatic artery of a young man being treated for excessive masturbation. In 1843, one of the first reports of castration for masturbation was published by Dr. Josiah Crosby of Meredith Bridge, New Hampshire. After cathartics and emetics had failed to cure a 22-year-old man whose health had reportedly been ruined by masturbation, Crosby castrated him and pronounced him cured. Right up until the beginning of the 20th century, boys caught masturbating were frequently committed to insane asylums, where they would be circumcised, castrated, and shackled in their cells. Females were subjected to female castration, a surgery involving the removal of the ovaries, aimed at curing them of hysteria, epilepsy, or nymphomania. Various other surgeries aimed at eliminating sexual desire and thereby stopping masturbation were also developed. Spermectomy was invented as a less drastic alternative to castration and consisted in the surgical removal of the spermatic ducts rather than the testicles. Neurectomy had a certain vogue in the 1890s. Commonly performed on boys who had been caught masturbating, this involved the physician severing the dorsal nerves of the penis in order to destroy sensation and function completely and permanently. American physicians also reported two relatively less drastic measures, such as slitting open the urethra, cauterizing the prostate, corporal punishment, blistering the penis with caustic acids or heat, flaying the skin of the penis with razor blades, sewing the penis shut with metal wire, which was called infibulation, encasing the genitals in plaster or lockable metal cages, or fitting the penis with rings studded with sharp teeth to discourage erections. In the case of females, the preferred treatment for epilepsy and masturbation was clitoridectomy. One of the first reports of therapeutic clitoridectomy was published in the San Francisco Medical Press in 1862. On December 1, 1855, the English surgeon Jonathan Hutchison, 1828 to 1913, published a paper that was to become one of the most influential texts in the history of circumcision advocacy. Quote, "On the influence of circumcision in preventing syphilis," end quote. During the 1850s, London experienced a massive immigration of Jewish settlers from the ghettos of Eastern Europe, attracted by the liberal and tolerant attitude prevailing in England. Hutchison reported that at the Metropolitan Free Hospital in East London, where many of the immigrants settled, fewer Jews than Englishmen sought treatment for syphilis. Being innocent of any awareness of the principles of statistical analysis, epidemiology, the germ theory of disease, or the quarantine effect of ghetto living, Hutchison asserted that only circumcision could account for the difference in the incidence of the disease. Despite its obvious flaws, Hutchison's paper was widely reported in foreign medical journals and continued to be cited as authoritative right up until the 1940s. Alarm, amounting to hysteria about masturbation, reached a climax in the last decades of the 19th century. Among the more influential American physicians who noticed this obsession and who contributed to it were Abraham Jacobi, 1830 to 1919, and M.J. Moses. Jacobi was the founder and first president of the American Pediatric Society, the first chairman of the section on diseases of children of the AMA, and president of the New York State Medical Society, the New York Academy of Medicine, and the Association of American Physicians. Please note that Jacobi and Moses are Jews. Both Jacobi and Moses asserted that Jewish boys were immune to masturbation because they were circumcised, and that non-Jews were especially prone to masturbation and all the terrible diseases that resulted from it simply because they retained their foreskin. Moses and Jacobi's studies acquired canonical authority. It is quite clear from the context that the title word hygienic, in quotes, has a different meaning from today. At that time, circumcision advocates used the words such as hygiene to denote moral hygiene, not personal cleanliness. Abraham Wohlbarst, 1872 to 1952, was a urologist practicing, among other places, at the Beth Israel Hospital and the Jewish Memorial Hospital in New York. In January 1914, he published in the Journal of the American Medical Association the first of a series of papers indicating the foreskin as the culprit in the diseases that were to haunt the imagination of the 20th century. Wohlbarst was a prominent and influential member of both the AMA and the notorious American Society of Sanitary and Moral Prophylaxis, a reform organization dedicated to the abolition of childhood and extramarital sexuality. His views on sexuality were characteristically extreme. In the 1930s, he argued that adult masturbators should be sterilized and forbidden to marry. In this paper, it is clear that the title word, quote, sanitary, denotes moral restraint rather than the absence of germs or dirt. It is important to note that until this time, circumcision was primarily imposed as a therapy for children and adults, but not as a prophylaxis for infants. As a result of Wohlbarst's ceaseless lobbying and agitation, however, the radical notion of universal, non-therapeutic, involuntary circumcision of young babies slowly gained acceptance among American physicians. The procedure was non-therapeutic because it was performed on normal, healthy children, showing no signs of deformation or disease. Medical textbooks were rewritten to instruct obstetricians and pediatricians to examine the penis of every newborn boy to determine whether the foreskin was retractable. If not, as was usually the case, the advice was that it be removed immediately. In 1932, Wohlbarst published what was long regarded as the definitive paper on circumcision as the most reliable preventative of cancer of the penis. Based on his, quote, observation, end quote, that Jewish men never got penile cancer, Woolbars theorized that the disease was caused by, quote, the accumulation of pathogenic products in the preputial cavity, end quote. Woolbars offered no scientific validation in support of this notion, yet based on this paper, the proposition that smegma was carcinogenic became widely accepted as a proven fact in the United States. The profit margin for circumcision procedures rose with the mass manufacture and wide distribution of the new ubiquitous Gomco clamp invented in 1934 by Aaron Goldstein and Dr. Hiram S. Yellen, both Jews. Gomco is an acronym for the Goldstein Manufacturing Company, which later changed its name to the Gomco Surgical Manufacturing Corporation of Buffalo, New York. This cruel stainless steel device is still widely used today to crush the foreskin and isolate it so that it can be excised by scalpel. The standardization of its surgical technique facilitated the rapid institutionalization of neonatal circumcision as a routine hospital procedure and led to the acceptance of the, quote, high and tight look, end quote, since the clamp usually produced a maximum loss of tissue that came to be regarded as the normal appearance of the penis. The September 1941 issue of Parents magazine included the first published article on the advisability of routine circumcision that had ever appeared in a popular magazine with such a wide readership. The author was Dr. Ian F. Guttmacher, an obstetrician at Johns Hopkins University Medical School, and he fed the public with many of the same myths and scare stories that had been in circulation since the 19th century. Like his predecessors, he admitted that circumcision causes blunting of male sexual sensitivity, but argued that this was an advantage. As well as citing Woolbar's discoveries about penile cancer, Guttmacher reiterated the Edwardian myth about the necessity for daily scrubbing of the glands. Although this had been a cliché of British Empire baby care guides from the 1890s until the 1930s, in Britain it had been exposed as a myth. The idea was new to American medical literature, however, and just as a better understanding of normal infant anatomy triumphed in Britain, old myths became consolidated in the United States. Mass recruitment and conscription during World War II put a lot of men under the power of military doctors with the authority to institute a campaign of near-routine circumcision of servicemen in all branches of the armed forces. Even at the height of World War II, Navy physician Lieutenant Marvin L. Gerber confidently stated in the pages of the United States Naval Medical Bulletin that circumcision was one of the most commonly performed surgical operations in the Navy, even more common than trauma surgery. Military doctors alleged that epidemics of phimosis and paraphimosis among soldiers justified the mass circumcision campaign. Men were regularly humiliated by unannounced examination of their penises. They were called short arm inspections, and many who had not been circumcised were declared to be suffering from phimosis and sent off to get cut. Court-martials were threatened if they showed reluctance. In the 1950s, an increasing number of corporation-managed hospitals and insurance companies entered the now profitable business of routine neonatal circumcision. Private hospitals instituted policies of immediate and automatic circumcision of all male neonates, often in the delivery room. Many urban hospitals adopted the policy of circumcising any boys who missed out at birth when they were brought in for other common procedures such as having their tonsils removed. In the late 1950s, the American circumcision industry sought to spread the practice to Europe with a particular focus on East and West Germany. the latter under extensive American influence as a result of the post-war occupation. Around 1957, the Gomco Corporation established a distribution network in Ulm, and in the same year, Kaiser worked with Otto Dietz, a minor official in the East Berlin secret police, to introduce circumcision in East Germany. In 1959, 150 babies born in a state-run clinic at Darmstadt, West Germany, were experimentally circumcised without anesthesia, a publicity stunt for the Gomco clamp, and in 1963, Dr. H. Koester arranged for the maternity clinic at the University of Gießen to adopt a policy of automatically circumcising all boys born there, again using the Gomco clamp. In 1968, a further demonstration of its speed and efficiency was arranged in East Germany. By the early 1970s, however, the experiments had aroused the disfavor of both East and West German authorities, and the experiments came to an end. Gomco promptly turned its attention to Denmark, and in 1973 arranged for 18 Danish newborns to be cut. Along with publicity photos of the clamp, the results were praised by the Danish medical press. The Danish public, however, were less impressed and strenuously resisted the idea of allowing their children's sexual organs to be surgically altered for any reason, and the campaign faded away. It is easy to see that Gomco's attempted push into Europe had nothing to do with health, but was entirely a commercial venture. Little more than that. There was some opposition to forcible circumcision. In 1956 and 1959, Dr. Richard K. Winkleman, a fellow in dermatology at the Mayo Clinic, published 2 studies which documented the intense innervation of the foreskin and identified it as a specific erogenous zone. In a period that was intensely hostile to sexual enjoyment, however, his studies were ignored. In 1954, Ravitch, R-A-V-I-C-H, Ravitch's theory that the foreskin caused cancer of the prostate was disproved, and in 1962, the hypothesis that it caused cervical cancer in women was falsified. In 1963, a further study invalidated Woolbar's contention that smegma was carcinogenic. In 1965, the trend towards skepticism was boosted when the Journal of American Medical Association, published by Dr. William Morgan's provocatively titled paper, quote, "The Rape of the Phallus," end quote. In this article, Morgan debunked all the then current arguments used by hospitals to justify involuntary circumcision and initiated a controversy within the American medical profession that continues to this day. The high water mark of involuntary circumcision was reached in the 1970s. With or without parental consent, hospital practice raised the incidence of neonatal circumcision to 90% in the late 1970s and early 80s. Circumcision advocates from urban areas took position in small rural hospitals in America's heartland and instituted new circumcision programs in regions of the country where it had not been known. At the same time, baby care guides, popular medical magazines, and health texts circulated myths to the effect that a boy not circumcised in infancy would suffer terrible psychological damage if he ever saw that his father's circumcised penis differed from his own. Oddly enough, this had not been raised as a problem when the father was uncircumcised and the boy cut, though you would think that a person would be more upset by lacking something his father possessed than possessing something his father lacked. Another myth that was particularly effective in exploiting middle-class anxieties about conformity and social status was that an uncut boy would be made to feel weird and inferior to his circumcised classmates in school locker rooms. Accurate information on the anatomy and physiology of the foreskin was omitted from American textbooks and replaced with the pseudoscience of the circumcision lobby. Even anatomical representations of the penis in standard urology texts silently omitted the foreskin and showed the penis as circumcised, as though it were that way by nature. The few drawings of the anatomy of the natural penis that could be found generally represented the foreskin incorrectly. The normal human penis became a strange and alien anomaly to the new generation of Americans, physicians and laymen alike, most of whom had never seen one. The Victorian masturbation hysteria was apparently still alive and well in American medical textbooks in the scientific 70s. Female circumcision had not entirely disappeared from American medical practice. In 1973, Dr. Leo Woolman, a gynecological surgeon at Maimonides Hospital in Brooklyn, published an article in which he argued for female circumcision as a cure for frigidity. Surgical modifications of the male and female genitalia, it was argued, would improve the quality of orgasm. This was the exact opposite of the message communicated a century before, when one of the chief virtues of circumcision was correctly held that its effect would be to reduce sexual sensation. The sudden reversal of argument convinced critics that American circumcision advocates were willing to say anything in order to push circumcision onto a gullible but increasingly suspicious public. In the 1980s, men finally began to wake up to what had been done to them as infants, and several lawsuits against doctors and hospitals in California were filed, charging that they had violated the constitutional rights of the plaintiffs by circumcising them without consent. The cases were filed in order to establish that parents did not have the right to consent by proxy to medically unnecessary surgery on their children, basing their claim on the 1975 AAP policy that circumcision was not medically necessary. The acknowledged lack of medical justification for circumcision put circumcisers at risk of litigation, but more importantly, the constitutional challenge of the legality of subjecting children to involuntary circumcision threatened to dismantle a lucrative medical sideline, which in 1986 was estimated to generate some $200 million annually. If neonatal circumcision were to survive, new medical excuses would have to be found. Since the 1980s, private hospitals have been in the business of supplying the foreskins they harvest to private biological research laboratories and pharmaceutical companies that require human tissue as raw research material, as well as manufacturers of cosmetics and artificial skin. So they don't just throw the foreskins away. The foreskin traders have always been there. The history of the institutionalization of involuntary circumcision in the United States demonstrates that American society has been willing to apply what it takes to be scientific measures at the expense of personal liberty. It is tempting to dismiss circumcision as merely a quaint example of medical quackery pursued by a handful of zealous doctors. We would do better to remember that in the name of scientific progress, millions of American citizens have been subjected to genital mutilation and deprived of an integral, functional, and beautiful part of their body. In the face of increasing international criticism and constitutional challenges, we must wonder how much longer the medical establishment will be able to continue to indulge in the kinds of illogical thinking and disregard for human rights that underpin their commitment to circumcision as prophylaxis and therapy. And that's the end of that piece. And I should mention that the clip that I played at the beginning of the show was titled The Unkindest Cut. Now I'm going to play a little short clip here, Circumcision, the Whole Story.
Have you ever had a cocktail party and you just can't seem to get your guests to leave? Well, try this. Bring up the topic of circumcision. Nothing empties a room faster than circumcision. It's a really difficult topic to discuss. My name is Dr. Christopher Gass. We're going to discuss this difficult topic. We're going to explore the historical origins of circumcision, how it became medicalized during the Victorian era, and we're also going to examine some of the current medical debate surrounding circumcision. Circumcision is not as common as you might think. Globally, about 80% of the world's men are intact. Only 20% of the world's men are circumcised. In the 1970s in Canada, about 70% of baby boys were circumcised. Well, that number has fallen significantly now, and less than 20% of Canadian babies are circumcised. When we look at Europe and Scandinavia, we would expect similar numbers to North America, but nothing is further from the truth. Virtually nobody is circumcised in Scandinavia. Finland is an interesting country because the rate of infant circumcision in Finland is 0%. We can follow Finnish boys and see what are the chances that they'll need a medically necessary circumcision later on in life. And we know from Finland that the odds of requiring a circumcision for medical reasons is about 1 in 16,000. It's not very likely that you'll ever need a circumcision. The rate of circumcision in Japan is less than 1%, and they don't seem to suffer medical problems from this. Look at a country like China, where there's 1.3 billion people, and none of them are circumcised. Chinese parents don't struggle with the decision to perform circumcision. It's not even a question. And China certainly doesn't suffer any public health problems from not circumcising their children. Most countries don't circumcise the majority of their male babies. One exception is the United States. In the United States, circumcision is big business. Over 1 million babies are circumcised every year in the U.S. Nobody knows exactly where circumcision originated. Our earliest historical evidence for circumcision is from ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, it was likely a substitute or a compromise for complete castration, and it was practiced among an elite group of priests. These priests enjoyed a special status after they underwent the ritual. From ancient Egypt, the practice then spread to the Semitic tribes living in the Middle East. The Edomites, the Ammonites, and the Israelites were all described as circumcising cultures. With regards to the Israelites, the practice really seemed to become entrenched around 500 BC, right after the return from captivity in Babylon and the creation of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. We also know about the circumcising tribes in the Middle East from the writings of the ancient Greeks. Now, the ancient Greeks felt completely differently about circumcision. The Greeks thought the practice was barbaric and a mutilation of a perfectly formed organ. The Greeks also valued the aesthetic of the foreskin, and for them it came to represent a symbol of the superiority of Greek culture over the irrational and superstitious practices of people in the Middle East. The Romans inherited much of Greek philosophy with regards to medicine, law, and ethics. And the Romans were opposed to circumcision because they thought it conflicted with the ethical concept of self-determination. And at many times during the empire, circumcision was actually decreed illegal. Towards the end of the Roman Empire, as Christianity emerged as the dominant religion, there arose a great conflict as to whether circumcision was required to become a Christian. The Jewish converts argued that it was required, whereas the Roman pagan converts argued that it wasn't required. Eventually, the early church fathers decided that circumcision was not required to become a Christian. And so that's how the situation remained for European Christians. For almost 2,000 years, circumcision was completely rejected from the fall of the Roman Empire right up until the Victorian era. So we're going to discuss how this cultural practice became a medical practice in the Victorian era. But first, we need to review the basic form and function of the human foreskin. The term foreskin seems like it's its own anatomical structure, but really the foreskin is just part of the normal, mobile covering of the penis. We give it a separate name so that when we cut it off, we say we cut off the foreskin. We cut off that part of the penis. The foreskin is a mucocutaneous junction. It's a specialized structure where skin meets mucous membrane, very similar to the lips. It starts from this blue line and extends down to the tip of the penis where this green line is located, but it's a double-sided structure. It folds back in on itself and returns to the blue line. When the penis becomes erect, the foreskin retracts and it exposes this inner surface. Now, the inner surface of the foreskin is very richly innervated. It's one of the most sensitive parts of the entire male body. It's rich in specialized nerve receptors, nerves that are only found in other areas like the fingertips. So ask yourself the following question. If you were to remove this tissue from the penis, is it more likely to increase sexual pleasure, or is it more likely to decrease sexual pleasure? These images show the difference between an intact penis and a circumcised penis. First of all, notice the color of the head of the penis on the circumcised penis. The color of the head is very similar to the rest of the skin on the shaft, and this is not normal. This is because of thickening or keratinization that's formed on the head of the penis. Removing the foreskin has externalized the head of the penis. It's meant to be an internal or protected part of the penis. The other thing to notice is the circumcision scar. This dark brown line is not a normal anatomical structure. It is the result of amputating part of the penis. Most circumcised men would describe the region between the circumcision scar and the head of the penis as the most sensitive part of the penis. And the reason for this is because this is where the foreskin used to be located, and the foreskin is the most heavily innervated and pleasurable part of the penis. On the other hand, the head or the glands of the intact penis, it's a different color. It's purple. It's smooth. It's more supple. It's also more sensitive. We don't see the skin thickening on the intact penis that we see on the circumcised penis because it's been protected by the foreskin. You'll also notice on the intact penis this area with multiple ridges. This is referred to as the ridged band, and it's one of the more heavily innervated parts of the foreskin. This part of the penis is very important for female sexual pleasure as well. Ribbed condoms are actually an attempt to mimic this part of the intact penis, which is absent from the circumcised penis. The foreskin also provides an important mechanical function. It serves as a gliding mechanism during sexual intercourse. On the outward motion, the foreskin bunches up to seal the vaginal opening. This prevents vaginal lubricants from being pulled out of the vagina during sex. It's no secret that the majority of sexual lubricants are sold in the United States, one of the countries that circumcises the majority of its children. On the inward motion, the foreskin unfolds and glides. This gliding action makes sex easier for both parties. It also exposes the highly erogenous inner foreskin to the vaginal mucosa. Our bodies are undoubtedly the result of evolution. The currency of evolution, the way evolution works, is through reproductive success. It doesn't matter how fast you can run, or how smart you are, or how strong you are. From an evolutionary perspective, the only thing that matters is how many offspring you leave. Reproductive success is everything from a Darwinian perspective. Are we then to believe that the penis, the organ of reproduction, is inefficient, that it has a design flaw, that it's prone to disease? This is the one part of our bodies that evolution would never tolerate any type of design flaw. It's too important for reproduction. Our genitals have an evolutionary track record of efficiency and success. And it's not just our species. All mammals have a foreskin. Think about the diversity among all of these mammals. Whales have evolved blowholes. Bats have evolved wings. They can fly. But all of these mammals still retain the same shape to the penis, and they all have a foreskin. To see the persistence of a structure among so many different mammals is evidence that this structure is important for reproductive success. It's a pretty tall claim for medicine to improve upon millions of years of evolution. Usually Mother Nature knows best. So how did circumcision become a medical procedure? Well, to answer this question, we have to go back to the Victorian era. During the Victorian era, physicians were convinced that masturbation caused disease. Circumcision was introduced as a means of preventing masturbation in order to prevent diseases. And one of the biggest proponents of circumcision was J. Harvey Kellogg, the inventor of cornflakes. J. Harvey Kellogg wrote books about circumcision and how it was great at preventing kids from masturbating. And then other Victorian physicians thought, well, if it cures masturbation, I wonder what else it cures. Here's a list of some of the diseases which circumcision has cured.
1845, Edward Dixon declares that circumcision cures masturbation. Now, you don't want to get carried away with that, but we know that didn't work, and it's certainly not a disease. 1855, Jonathan Hutchinson claims that circumcision cures syphilis. 1865, Nathaniel Heckford claims circumcision cures epilepsy. 1870, Louis Sayre, S-A-Y-R-E or Sayre, claims circumcision cures spinal paralysis. 1873, Joseph Bell claims circumcision cures bedwetting. 1875, Louis Sayre declares circumcision prevents certain bladder problems and clubfoot. 1881, Maximilian Landesberg claims circumcision cures all eye problems. 1890, William Gentry claims circumcision cures blindness, deafness, and dumbness. 1894, P. Remondino, R-E-M-O-N-D-I-N-O, claims circumcising blacks will prevent them from raping white women. Well, they currently, most of them being circumcised, rape almost 40,000 whites every year here in the United States. So imagine the rapes that would occur from nigger raping if they had not had their foreskin amputated. Now, I would prefer that their heads be amputated. Not the penis head, but rather that ugly blob on their shoulders. 1894, H. Rosenberry claims circumcision cures rectal incontinence. 1894, Abraham Wobarst claims circumcision cures tuberculosis. 1926, Abraham Ravitch claims circumcision prevents prostate cancer. I skipped several of the outlandish claims, so check out the description box for the video that's linked there.
Nowadays, circumcision is promoted as a means of preventing urinary tract infections, penile cancer, cervical cancer, and sexually transmitted diseases. Well, most medical associations don't agree with any of that, but let's assume for a second that circumcision actually does prevent these diseases. What does that mean? Let's talk about penile cancer. The incidence of penile cancer is 1 in 200,000. As a man, you're more likely to die of breast cancer than penile cancer. If circumcision was 100% effective at preventing penile cancer, you would have to perform 200,000 circumcisions to prevent 1 case of penile cancer. Well, what about urinary tract infections? Non-circumcising countries like Japan and Sweden, well, they don't have problems with urinary tract infections among their boys. And even if circumcision was effective, what is the incidence of urinary tract infection among boys? It's about 1 in 186. You'd have to perform 186 circumcisions to prevent 1 urinary tract infection, which you could easily cure with antibiotics. Just like when little girls develop urinary tract infections, boys should be treated with antibiotics, not with surgery. We don't remove healthy tissue from children in order to possibly prevent some future disease. Now, what about HIV? The United States, which has a very high rate of circumcision, also has the highest rate of HIV infection among all industrialized nations. And compare that to a country like Sweden, where the rate of circumcision is very low. They also have much lower rates of HIV infection. So I ask you, is circumcision helping prevent HIV in the United States? Clearly, The most effective way to prevent HIV is through safe sexual practices. Circumcision is not an effective or ethical means of preventing HIV.
Common questions. Should my son look like me?
What if Dad had a big scar over his left eye? Would you give that to your son as well? How many fathers and sons sit around naked with each other, staring at each other's genitals? This isn't really a problem.
Isn't it hard to clean? And could it get infected?
Soap and water for little girls, but scalpels for little boys? Men are smart enough to know how to clean our genitals.
Well, what if he has to be circumcised later?
Well, what if he has to have his appendix removed later on? We don't do that just in case. The truth is that most medically necessary circumcisions actually aren't necessary. The problem is that even minor medical issues with the foreskin are automatically treated with surgical amputation. And to be honest, most medical issues with the foreskin are actually caused by caregivers forcibly trying to retract the foreskin. Care of the foreskin is actually very easy. There's only 2 rules you need to follow. Number 1, only clean what is seen. Don't try to retract the foreskin and clean underneath. And number 2, the only person who should ever retract the foreskin is the boy. Routine infant circumcision is a violation of basic medical ethics. It's surgery without an indication. It's the cure for a disease that doesn't really exist. Infant circumcision also violates the principles of autonomy. It's performed on individuals, children, who are unable to provide consent. I believe circumcision is a violation of human rights. It's a violation of the fundamental human right to bodily integrity. Everybody owns their own body. Think about that. If you don't own your own body, what do you own? If you're older and you're an adult and you'd like to remove part of your body, then that should be your choice. But children are too young to consent. As parents, we're their guardians. It's our job to protect our children, both little boys and little girls. This is not just a problem for future parents. This is a problem for all of our society. We need to start a dialogue around circumcision. We need to make sure that people are educated and know all the facts about circumcision. We have to make sure that they have the whole story.
And the next clip I'm going to play is Why Circumcision is Unnecessary with Dr. John Travis.
Let's talk about circumcision. Cutting off 3/4 of the skin area of an infant's penis without his permission. Like, what kind of human rights violation could top that? I think it's the largest human rights violation on the planet. It's being done under medical excuses. North America, or actually specifically the U.S., Canada's rate is much lower, is the only developed nation besides South Korea that routinely circumcises neonates. It's a religious right for Muslims, Jews, and some Christians, though actually St. Paul recommended against circumcision. There's even a saying in Deuteronomy of circumcise therefore the foreskins of your heart and be ye no more stiff-necked. But it makes a lot more sense to open up your heart than to cut off 3/4 of the most sensitive nerve endings on your body. And the original Abraham's covenant with God only involved drawing blood or a nick. It didn't involve exposing the whole glands or the head of the penis. That occurred thousands of years later, around 100 AD. And what happened was that the the rabbis, they changed what had been called Brit Mila to Brit Pariah. It was a radical change in the procedure where they cut off most of the foreskin. It's pretty well documented, and it radically changed the whole situation. And then 1,000 years later, Moses Maimonides, in Guide to the Perplexed, makes it very clear that circumcision is to reduce the sexual sensitivity of the man. He got it. The idea in the late 1800s, when Kellogg and those fellows were recommending it for so-called health reasons, was basically to stop masturbation. And they were thinking masturbation caused blindness and hair growing in your palms and so on and so forth. Very Victorian ideas at the time. So we have a surgical procedure in search of a disease, and there have been about 100 different diseases connected with circumcision, all of which have failed to pass the test of time, from urinary tract infections, which still gets play. The fact is that they didn't control for premature retraction. And that's one of the biggest problems we have nowadays, is that most doctors are circumcised, have never seen a foreskin, don't know how to take care of one, and they're still peeling it back on these little babies, tearing the adhesions. It's like a kitten's eyes, like ripping their eyes open before they're meant to be open, which causes a lot of damage later. The Doctors Opposing Circumcision, DOC organization, has a little sticker you can put on the baby's diaper saying, "I'm intact, don't retract." And mothers are constantly reporting doctors ripping back the foreskin, causing extreme pain and ongoing infections and often a need to circumcise. So this whole issue of premature retraction has got to be addressed, as we now have nearly 2/3 of the boys are escaping circumcision, and we have a large population of intact boys with doctors who don't have a clue how to take care of a foreskin. And there's actually little to take care of. It's preventing them from peeling it back or telling the mother to peel it back. It's a no-brainer. So we have this gradual increase in the amount of skin taken off from Abraham's original covenant to what's being done nowadays with the Plastibell and the other devices that are used. So we have a radically different surgical procedure going on, both medically and religiously, than what was originally planned. Circumcision is the only operation that's performed on a non-consenting child that has no medical reason. It defies all bioethical policies. It's grandfathered in out of ignorance and out of denial, largely by people who are themselves circumcised and don't want to address the issue of what did I lose. In my own case, I was in my 50s before I even noticed that it was a problem or could be a problem. Sure, I knew I was missing a useless flap of skin, but, it was supposedly healthier and so forth. When I found out that 3/4 of the nerve endings were missing, and this was only recently discovered. One study has been done comparing about 160 men in two groups, circumcised and intact, and found that the most sensitive part of the penis is the foreskin by miles. The least sensitive part is the glands, which is about as sensitive as the heel of your foot, and yet people still, from Johnson and Masters and Johnson's mythology, that there wasn't any difference and that the glands is the most sensitive. They didn't even know what a foreskin was. The drawings in their book in the 60s indicate they didn't. And they claimed there was no difference, but they don't have any data to support it. There is actually a huge difference. And I hear many men say, well, I'm not missing anything, or I wouldn't want to be any more sensitive. But it's not about extremes. When you're circumcised, you basically have an on-off position. You're either not excited or you ejaculate. There's a whole range in between. And I often say, why is it that women fake orgasm? And the answer is because men fake foreplay. Well, then why do men fake foreplay? They don't have the equipment to enjoy it. It's something they have to do to get the woman warmed up, but they're not getting any pleasure out of it because they've lost the equipment that would enjoy it. Someone's likened it to having a foreskin as like a second movement of a Sibelius symphony compared to the 1812 overture, all the bang, bang cannons and fireworks. You know, you get from nowhere to there without the second movement in between. And those of us who've never had that equipment can't appreciate it. But men who have lost it, had it and lost it, who either chose to get circumcised by misinformation or had some problem that they needed to, they know the difference, and they report about 1/4 of the sensitivity that they once had. So it's not talked about. The culture is so afraid to talk about it. Then we have another whole issue of a procedure in search of a disease, and all of the diseases that it's purported to cure, from masturbation to epilepsy to schizophrenia to urinary tract infections, cancer of the penis, none of them have held up to scientific scrutiny. The latest one is HIV/AIDS in Africa. There were 3 studies done that were highly biased, seriously flawed, and they purport to show a 60% reduction in transmission from females to males. It actually is greater from males to females, but that hasn't been talked about. But the studies are so confounded with other variables. They were stopped early. Just a lot of things that were done. There was big money behind them, I believe. They were clearly on a mission to bring circumcision to Africa. Been raising millions of dollars from the Gates Foundation and other sources. The flawed idea that this is going to stop HIV/AIDS in Africa. If you just look at the simple numbers of Europe is largely uncircumcised, has a low HIV rate. The U.S. is largely circumcised, has a high HIV rate. How hard can it be to see there ain't no correlation? It doesn't make any sense. And millions of dollars are going into this effort, and the UN AIDS people have been behind it. At the same time, they're fighting female circumcision. They're promoting male circumcision. If it's done to an infant, it seems like a minor procedure as opposed to a young girl having her clitoris either dehooded or removed. The actual neurologic damage done to a boy to be traumatized at such an early age, and how he develops psychologically differently. And there are some measures you can, like alexithymia, which is the inability to put words to feelings, is 4 times higher in boys who have been circumcised. But 4 times the rate is significant and definitely needs to be studied. So we have all of these competing interests. It's a $1 billion to $2 billion a year industry in the U.S. And if you follow the money, all the countries where it stopped, like Australia where I live, they stopped the funding in the 70s, the rates plummeted. It's been around 10%, and you have to pay for it. In Canada, it's a similar number. New Zealand, it's 0.5%. England, they stopped funding it in the late 40s when their National Health Service plan, they decided not to fund it. It stopped. So it's definitely tied to the financial interests of those in the industry. And if we stop the funding, as 16 states have stopped funding it under Medicare, it changes the whole ballgame. One of the reasons the rate remains so high, particularly in the Midwest, is that hospitals promote it. They make money on it. They don't have adequate informed consent. You just sign a form, you don't know what you're doing. Parents have no clue what it looks like. You never get to see it done. If you watch a video on YouTube, I guarantee you won't let your child be circumcised. The screaming, the looks that they give the camera are heartrending. And so, as I always, my friend Marilyn Milo says, babies are born perfect, let's keep them that way, or bring the whole baby home if you have a hospital birth. We have a perfectly designed genital structure, the foreskin, and cutting it off is, to me, a major violation of boys' human rights. And my guess is that there will be lawsuits when these boys turn 18, that there's now adequate data to show there aren't any health reasons. No medical organization in the world recommends it. So as people wake up, as parents wake up, recognize what's really being done to these little boys, I think there's great hope that we will raise a generation of intact boys and raise them intact and let them experience their full range of sexuality and not have to fake foreplay so their women aren't going to be faking orgasm. It's going to hurt the drug sales of erectile dysfunction drugs, but we're going to see a generation of men who are going to be more connected to their women, who are not going to experience the dynamic of disappearing dads, who are going to stay with their children, who are going to be overall happier men.
All right. Well, this piece was the piece that's actually spurred this show. It's a piece that I found in the VNN library, and it's written by a woman, Elizabeth Bennett. And the title of this paper is Childbirth, Circumcision, and Sex Dysfunction. I have edited out the childbirth portion of this article, but you can certainly read that, and it's got some important information too, but since it doesn't deal precisely with circumcision, I've edited that out. So, all right, this is how she starts the paper. Disclaimer to keep me from being arrested. This chapter is not medical advice. I don't know anything, and ask your God, the state licensed physician, before you sneeze or begin any exercise program. I'm not a doctor because I don't have an MD degree. My First Amendment rights mean nothing in the face of arguing with anything the sacred medical establishment says. Well, now that you know I'm not a big swell-headed doctor, we can move on. Don't make the mistake of engaging in, quote, casual sex, end quote, under the false idea it will make you a better lover or husband later. Your experience will be entirely the wrong kind of experience, and anything but casual in terms of the permanent skeletons in your closet, silent, incurable venereal diseases which affect about 60% of Americans today, child support payments, and most importantly, psychological alienation. My own experience and candid conversations with male and female friends has convinced me of this immutable fact. A man's level of sexual experience has almost nothing to do with being a good lover. Attitude, reading, true love, and circumcision status has everything to do with it. Does this last surprise you? If you think in terms of essentials, and you are naturalistic, it should not. Now, I'm going to talk about a subject that fills me with pain. It's very difficult for me to tell you the whole horrible truth without hiding from reality, to make ourselves feel better. If you are circumcised but have emotional warmth and rationality intact, what I'm about to say will be gut-wrenching. You will feel like hunting down the doctor who cut off the end of your penis and torturing him. After you count to 100, you will feel like going to the root of the problem, house cleaning the Jewish parasites and the dumb lemming goyim out of this country. Citizenship is a privilege, not a right. If you are circumcised, you have been sexually mutilated. You are unable to have sex with a woman in anything close to a normal way. Love-making techniques and communication are tiny band-aids over the gaping wound that is your relationship. Your circumcision is the giant, bloody, severed ox head on the table, rotting and filled with maggots that everyone, including your parents, ignores, while politely sipping cocktails and pretending everything is normal. You must face the fact that you were sexually mutilated by establishment rapists in white coats. Go through a grieving process and take steps to correct the damage that has been done to you to the best of your ability. Only 1% of the world's human males are circumcised, and the vast majority of these are Semites, Jews and Arabs, and Americans. Unlike Jews and Arabs, Americans are the only people who sexually mutilate their sons for, quote, non-religious, end quote, reasons. In America, puritanical rationalization and pseudoscience is our religion. For basic information on what circumcision is and how it destroys sex, please visit these two web pages. and that was www.cirp.org/library/procedure/Plastibel. I put these links in my show page for the show. So, read it yet? Good. Take a deep breath. You're safe inside your home now. Have not read it yet? Follow the links and read. You must. Jews go to even more sadistic levels of violence when they skin the baby's penis and slice off the coverings. They take a sharp metal knife or a spiny wooden stick and scrape it repeatedly over the covering of the bloody infant's nubbin while it screams, defecates, chokes, and faints. This is to ensure that the head of the penis is so scarified, no cells that can produce mucus remain. The process is called pariah and gained popularity during the Roman Empire to stop adult Jewish men from uncircumcising themselves through a method similar to what Bigelow recommends in his wonderful Uncircumcising book. After pariah, the sick Jewish mohel takes the infant's bloody, scarified little penis in his mouth and sucks it vigorously in a rite called metzitza. That's right, they're the only tribe that practices infant fellatio as part of their sexual mutilation rites. Having sex with a circumcised man is uncomfortable for a woman, and this discomfort, often pain, quickly trains her to avoid sex. She makes excuses like, I have a headache, I'm too stressed out about housework, or, more honestly, I have a bladder infection or cystitis, or I feel chafed, or I feel bruised from the last time. In an intact man, the head of the penis is not, quote, red bumpy skin, end quote, but a mucous membrane, which, like the inside of a woman's vagina. A layer of mucus only 4 cells thick separates his raw nerve endings from his wife's vagina, or the slick inside of his erogenous foreskin. Masturbation doesn't require lotion, soap and water, or Vaseline, nor does it require jerking the penis with rough, forceful energy. Most often, he can have a climax from a very light touch. So he can masturbate or have sex with his wife 8 times a day without the shaft of his penis feeling sore, mashed, or desensitized. In a sexually mutilated man, what used to be the inside of his foreskin is tightly stretched and has fused onto the shaft of his penis. It's everything below the red circumcision scar. Both the reattached foreskin and the head have been thickened by a rough layer of shriveled, leathery scarring, or keratinization. The body's clumsy attempt to seal a ripped open mucous membrane that is exposed to abrasion from diapers, underwear, bedding, and drying from the air. You might conclude that circumcised sex is much rougher, clumsier, and dramatically limited in variety compared to intact sex. You would be right. The two cannot be compared. They are very different activities. Foreskin has about 500,000 nerve endings, or dendrites, 1/3 of the nerve endings in the penis. In its surface area is on average 15 inches square, or half the surface area of the penis. The inside of it feels like a woman's vagina because it is a wet mucous membrane against the wet, waxy mucus-covered head. The sensation of the foreskin retracting and moving forward against the glands is impossible to explain to a circumcised man, but possible for a woman to identify with. It's a full-spectrum, shimmering, infinitely dimensional feeling of pleasure, like that of the labia and hood of the clitoris and clitoris gliding against each other. Both sheath and shaft can be felt simultaneously, as sort of like experiencing sex as it feels to the penis and vagina both at the same time. An intact man has an intact frenulum, Frenulum, or extremely dense bundle of nerves where the foreskin attaches to the penis. It's analogous to the female clitoris. In circumcision, the male clitoris is amputated. His foreskin is not hard to take care of or smelly. Once a day in the shower, he spends about 5 seconds pulling the foreskin back and rinsing underneath it. But a thin coating of mucus and day-old smegma make the head of his penis feel slippery, like Astroglide or KY jelly to a woman, as opposed to a dry piece of rubber or plastic dildo like a circumcised penis. Foreskin contains unique pheromone glands found nowhere else on the body that about 30% of women could consciously notice when sitting next to him on the couch or standing near him. The other 70% are only subconsciously affected by these airborne sexual chemicals and feel an increased sense of well-being, relaxation, and sexual arousal in his presence. A circumcised man is more neuter in this respect. He smells more like a plastic mannequin to a woman. An intact male enjoys being fondled and touched before intercourse just as much as woman. He does not rush insanely to penetrate so he can finally feel a smooth, wet coating around the head of his penis. There is no disconnect between the two partners during foreplay. The sex act is not abbreviated. Circumcision got started in America due to Jewish control of both the AMA and the media. They exploited the strong base of Goyim Puritanism in America to get their agenda of big lies across. Popular child-rearing books, which sold 4 million copies before 1945, such as Holt's Disease of Infancy and Childhood and The Ideal Woman for Maidens, Wives, and Mothers, advocated circumcision to prevent, gasp, that terrible sin, masturbation. Here is a quote from Maidens, Wives, and Mothers. Quote, "Self-abuse lays the foundation for consumption, paralysis, and heart disease. It weakens the memory, makes the boy careless, negligent, and listless. It even makes many lose their minds. Others, when grown, commit suicide. How often mothers see little boys handling themselves and let it pass because they think the boy will outgrow the habit and do not realize the strong hold it has upon them. I say to you who love your boys, watch. The victim is often very near death before you realize what he has done to himself. It is worthy of note that many eminent physicians now advocate the custom of circumcision, claiming that the removal of the little of the foreskin induces cleanliness, thus preventing the irritation and excitement which come from the gathering of the whitish matter under the foreskin at the beginning of the glands. This irritation being removed, the boy is less apt to tamper with his sexual organs. This argument seems a good one, especially when we call to mind the high physical state of those people who have practiced the custom. Happy is the mother who can feel she has done her duty in this direction while her boy is still a child." End quote. Orgasm is, quote, self-abuse, end quote. Enjoying is tampering with. Ecstatic pleasure is irritation. And hiring a Jew in a high physical state to skin the end of your child's penis and cut it off is a mother's duty and shows love. War is peace and freedom is slavery. You'd have to be high to do that, all right. Please pass the LSD. Americans have always been puritanical. All of their mental problems and hang-ups they attempt to make go away with all of their washes. The average American woman is so uptight she'll use a tube of Summer's Eve FDS flower-scented cleanser up her vagina 3 times a month and inject it with a bunch of perfume and vinegar, then wonder stupidly why she's uncomfortable, why she has yeast and staph infections all the time. Cuckoo, cuckoo, crazy. Deodorant maxi pads, red allergic rashes. An American phenomena. When the lie that foreskins cause cervical cancer was exposed, they said cervical cancer was caused by nothing and everyone was at risk. They convinced the poor virginal white goyim to go to the gynecologist when she was 18 and get her hymen painfully stretched, ripped or torn when a sick robot in a white coat shoved a speculum up her to do a pap smear. Get your pap smears every 6 months, we are told constantly. The poor girls died of humiliation and embarrassment. It felt like a rape or a molestation, didn't it? Jewess Judy Blume and her 6 scatology books were very popular among teen girls, and they spread the lie about the pap smear rite of passage at age 18. So did government school propaganda materials for grade school kids like the Weekly Reader. Sick gyno exams with a speculum-wielding Jew doc robbed the first man they had sex with of seeing and feeling a hymen and being sure they were a virgin. Their first penetration experience was from a Jew, a gyno, instead of a white man they loved. And how would you like to be the first man who gave you a breast exam to be a sick old Jew pretending to be afraid you might have breast cancer, little maiden? In reality, a lot of these girls were in so much pain they lost bladder control and urinated on the table. Mr. Spock in the white coat briskly, efficiently continued penetrating to ignore it. Don't ask your physician before lifting a pillow or beginning any exercise program. Don't ask your physician what the reasons are for skinning your infant son's penis and ripping it off. Don't ask your physician, period. Ask yourself. Take responsibility for your own health, your own medical care, and your own thinking. And don't bring your son into the hospital to have his tonsils out or his appendix removed. In most hospitals, the policy is to circumcise any child who's under anesthesia under the catch-all medical consent form that signs away the right to do anything they want without asking the parents. The Jews and the textbook memorizing goyim they educated in state-controlled medical schools control the hospitals. Stay out of them. Go to a naturopathic doctor or midwife unless you need surgery. Write no circumcision on the medical release form and demand a copy of it. Never let a Jewish doctor operate on your folk. Remember, the Talmud says the Jewish physician is under no moral obligation to, quote, do no harm, end quote, to a goy patient. Non-Jews are animals and guinea pigs to Jewish doctors, says the Talmud. Without a foreskin and a smooth, wet glans to aid penetration, it feels a lot like being penetrated by a dry rubber dildo. When he starts thrusting, the penis scrapes methodically back and forth against the woman's urethra, introducing bacteria, including E. coli, which can be anything from uncomfortable to excruciatingly painful. The sexual rhythm is off from what an uncircumcised man does and a woman does with an object to induce G-spot orgasm. Afterward, the woman feels like she needs to pee really bad because her sensitive urethra has been stripped of meatus and mucus and severely abraded. After she pees, she still feels like she needs to pee really bad. She smiles and tries to pretend she enjoyed it because women are supposed to be really horny and enjoy sex just as much as men, right? 12 to 36 hours later, she feels like she really needs to pee. When she sits on the potty, hardly anything comes out of her bladder except a teaspoonful of blood and pus. She has a urinary tract infection, which our Jew medical establishment says is quite normal in women. How come women in Europe, South America, and Asia never get them? A woman gets a bladder infection every time she has sex, and this is normal because women's ureters are too short, chirps the Jew. 70% of American women get bladder infections from intercourse. 15% of American women have so many bladder infections from having intercourse that the lining of their bladder is dead, absent. They feel like they need to pee excruciatingly badly 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It's a disease that very few women ever recover from. It's called interstitial cystitis or urethritis or female complaints. It causes premature aging as waste products seep back into the body through the bladder. It causes extreme stress. It causes hatred of men and their damn selfish sex drive that hurts me like hell. And it explains why Jewesses are even worse shrews than Jew men. It also explains, together with refined sugar, why yeast infections from abrasion to vaginal lining have spawned a multi-million-dollar business in snake oil yeast infection treatments like Monistat 7. Go to the grocery store, it takes up more shelf space than the contact lens solution and costs $20 a pop. Now that's profit. Hear the clink of all those shekels rolling in? It's almost as good as circumcision. $800 in pure profit for surgery that takes 10 minutes on a formerly healthy infant. And about yeast infections, if you're a woman and you're listening and you get them, or you're a man and you have a woman that gets them, use garlic. Get the largest cloves of garlic that you can find, 2 large cloves, cut them in half, and then thread a needle with some nice sturdy thread and leave the tail long and put it through the garlic cloves and insert the garlic cloves into your vagina, and the yeast infection will be gone the next morning. So that's my cure. After all this, women begin to complain, I don't enjoy sex anymore. I don't feel like it. New groups of crackpots appear to say women are from Venus and men are from Mars, and women give out sex to get love, and women like foreplay, men like sex. Really, these women would be better off reading Sex as Nature Intended It and the semi-helpful but not root cause You Don't Have to Live with Cystitis, and drinking some marshmallow root tea every morning instead of coffee, and giving your worn-out bodies a few years to slowly heal. Long before you have sex with a woman, read The Joy of Uncircumcising by Jim Bigelow, Ph.D., and Sex the Way Nature Intended It by Kristen and Jeffrey O'Hara. And that book is available online at sexasnatureintendedit.com. Bigelow's book explores the sadistic Jewish roots of circumcision and quotes ancient rabbis who explicitly stated the purpose of the procedure was to drive a wedge between husband and wife, transmuting spousal loyalty into loyalty to the Jewish cult. Says one rabbi, quote, "The wife of the uncircumcised will not betray him to the church elders," end quote. Bigelow also covers the way Jews in the government used massive forced circumcision in 2 world wars and its control over the Jew-controlled medical establishment to circumcise a greater proportion of male infants with each successive generation of Americans, until finally the abnormal is defined as normal. He explores the psychology of doctors and nurses who defend this sick and bizarre torture, and the sociological factors involved, including the evasions of the sexually mutilated father who insists on mutilating his son rather than admit that he himself is abnormal. The last half of the book describes in detail how to correct much of the damage that was done to you through a gradual process of shaft skin tissue growth. It is painless and costs about $25. This book is the best book on circumcision in existence, and every intelligent adult in America should read it. And one other thing. Would you, of sound mind, take the male birth control pill? Female hormones which stop you from producing sperm? Of course not. So don't expect women to take the birth control pill, which deactivates her ovaries, dries up her vagina, and shrinks her uterus from the size of a pear to the prepubescent size of a prune. The birth control pill essentially makes women go through menopause when they're young, not to mention that unhealthy, pasty look, all the weight gain, and the blood clots and strokes. Stroke wards are full of 30-year-old women now instead of old men, all because that sick little pill. But gee, the ads have smiling gals on them, and it cures acne. Be natural about sex and get her pregnant. It doesn't cost 10% as much as you think it does to support a child. Or if that really isn't an option, should you be having sex if it isn't? Use the cervical cap or a small-size diaphragm fit the way it describes in You Don't Have to Live with Cystitis. Birth control is very hard on a woman's body. In fact, in most cases, sex and birth control in America ruin a woman's body. All the forms are either painful, the IUD feels a lot worse than the labor pains, and the condom causes bladder infections. Poisonous hormonal pills, implants, and injections all interfere with her pleasure. Rather than try to escape your nature and animality by surgery, drugs, and birth control, why not just have a big family and reproduce the white race? Create more people like you. Maybe big Catholic families aren't so bad after all. Usually when you do things the natural way, you don't go too far wrong. If you can't afford to support a family, maybe you shouldn't be courting yet and going the artificial instead of naturalistic path. Develop yourself and save your money instead. And there are a lot of fun things you can do with a high-quality woman besides court her and have sex with her. The end. Well, that's it. And I want to thank you for joining me. And it's all about the 14 words, all of it. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. I bid you adieu. Long live Tay-Sachs and sickle cell. Good night.